Okay, well, if you missed part one of our interview with David Sheen, um, this is part two where we're going to talk about David's deep investigation into the murder of Alex Odeh, the West Coast regional coordinator for the Arab Anti Discrimination Committee, um, who was murdered by, it seems pretty clear that he was murdered by um, at least a pair of Jewish extremists, ultra Zionist extremists who came from West Bank settlements and returned to West Bank settlements under the watch of several successive Israeli governments. And David has done the most painstaking, thorough investigation into this murder. If you missed part one, David is a longtime journalistic collaborator with me. You can pretty much read his life story in my book, Goliath, Life and Loathing in Israel. And he's in Haifa, Israel right now. And he is a veteran activist for the rights of asylum seekers in Israel and against Israeli apartheid, and a journalist who's contributed to pretty much any publication that has done any decent work on Israel Palestine. Most recently, I guess as we speak, or a few minutes ago, David's fourth investigative piece on the murder of Alex Odeh appeared at Electronic Intifada, electronicintifada.net. It's definitely a site you should be following, and we'll put that article and his other pieces in our show notes. David, this murder took place in 1985 in Orange County, California. I actually got to meet Alex Odeh's family during a talk I did in Orange County at a community center where I and several other Palestine solidarity activists and journalists and academics were thrown out under pressure from Stand With Us, a pro-Israel group. And so we got together in a tent across the street because, they love putting Palestinians in tents. And we had dinner with Alex Odeh's widow and his children, who are grown, adults now. But he was blown up in a bomb at his office. There had been other bombings, attempts on the lives of him and his colleagues. The Jewish Defense League, a terrorist group, a Zionist terrorist group, was very active in LA until its leader, Irv Rubin, was, I think, killed in the year 2000 or jumped off a high, jumped off a balcony in LA County Jail after he was jailed for attempting to kill Representative Darrell Issa, at the time the only Arab American in Congress. But basically, this all happened back in 1985. Why does it matter now? Why did you invest so much energy into it? And why are you just so dogged about this case?
Mhm, mhm. Sure, yeah, it's a good question. There's people who are dying today while we speak. So why this old murder case? Well, I actually wasn't looking for it. I didn't go out looking for it, but it plopped in my lap. And the way it did so was because just over a year ago, Netanyahu called for elections. We just spoke about elections just now. But at that point, when he called for elections, going for the first of the three consecutive elections, he mainstreamed the followers of Mayor Kahana, the arch racist rabbi who, totally changed Israeli politics in the 70s and 80s when he became a Knesset member in 1984. And what he did was he made it acceptable to say openly what people only thought and didn't allow themselves to say, which was that they wanted half the country, half the Jews in the country want ethnic cleansing. Until then, people were embarrassed to say it, but Kahana broke that taboo and he made it okay to say it and to call for it. And so Netanyahu, leading up to the first of these three consecutive elections, when he mainstreamed and whitewashed the followers of this arch-racist rabbi and brought, or meant to bring, tried to bring, labored to bring this ultra-racist party into his governing coalition, then I'm like, whoa, this is a crazy, crazy red line. Back in the day when the original Rabbi Kahana was in the Knesset, the entire Knesset band together to expel him from the Knesset. Even Netanyahu's ruling Likud party voted to make his overt kind of racism an offense for which you can be expelled from the Knesset or not be permitted to run for the Knesset. So back in the day, members of Netanyahu's own party considered it not only racist, but akin to Nazism. Even members of his own party said this in the Knesset, that's how racist it was. But now here, 30 years later, Netanyahu is saying, no, not only are they not too racist to be in the Knesset, but they're not too racist for my government. To serve with me in my government. This is a red line that no one was speaking about, right? So I'm like, okay, we need to understand the significance, to understand how far low we've sunk.
Right.
And so I said, okay, now we gotta talk about the Kahana movement. And of course, I knew them relatively well. Me and you recall how 10 years ago we interviewed member of Knesset, Michael Ben Ari, follower of Meir Kahana, in his office in Jerusalem in the Knesset. And so, both interviewing Kahanists like him in his office and others on the streets at demonstrations and following them for years, I knew their story, but I didn't know the backstory. I knew what they'd been doing in the past decade, but I didn't know what had happened in, the late 60s, 70s, 80s. All that, was before I came into the picture. So I realized, okay, if I'm going to tell their story, I need to know the backstory. And so I started reading biographies of Kahana and really getting to know the story arc. At the end of it, I was like, okay, well, what happened to these guys? What happened after Kahana was eventually assassinated. So in any case, after Kahana was assassinated, what happened to the movement? And I started Googling the names because, these biographies of him had been written pre-internet era. So now I'm Googling the names of all these people who, from these biographies, were his henchmen, committed crimes with him. Where did they go on today? And, sure, some of them went on to various jobs and, got government positions here and there, minor positions here and there and whatnot, and Likud governments. But then I left for the end the ones who were, allegedly assassins, those who were accused of murder. And then lo and behold, I realized that they weren't hiding. They were hiding in plain sight. It wasn't like I had superpowers or anything. I just can read and write and speak and, Hebrew. And so I was able to search in Hebrew, and there's a complete disconnect. In English, you search for the names of the suspected murderers of Alex Odeh, and it's just like, well, we don't know what happened to this guy. It's just his footsteps have, he's left no trace. We think he's in Israel, but we don't know what's happening with him. And then if you read the Israeli press, he never stopped being he never went out of the limelight. He's always been in it. He's continued to be a Kahanist activist, pushing the agenda of Kahana, the ideology of Kahana, to ethnically cleanse all of Israel and all the territories it occupies, to ethnically cleanse them of non-Jews. That's Kahana's openly stated vision, and his followers have continued to preach this genocidal gospel all these years. And the Israeli media is, full of quotes from this guy that supposedly, according to the US media, no one knows where he is. Yet here he is in Israel, continuing to preach genocide, essentially, call to expel all, Palestinians from the country.
So just to bring it home, you have two followers of Meir Kahana who you have identified as the killers of Alex Odeh living openly in, is it Kiryat Arba?
Okay, just rewind it 1 second. I was not there in 1985. I don't have police experience. I didn't take all the forensic evidence. So I am not saying that they are the ones who did it. But that is what the FBI is saying. Okay, the FBI.
You spoke to joint anti-terror task force members of the FBI. Am I right?
Correct.
And they told you that they know who did it. They wouldn't name themselves, but they told you on background, we know who did it. We know where they did it. We know why they did it.
Exactly. So I knew who these dudes were, and these are the dudes. These are the guys. So one of them, as you pointed out, you mentioned Kiryat Arba. They both used to live in Kiryat Arba, which is a settlement besides Hebron, like the largest Palestinian city in the southern West Bank. So
And they
they
have
both used to live there.
there's a memorial just to for those who don't know how extreme this settlement is, which is in the middle of Hebron. It's the most just infested with the most violent elements who come out and attack Palestinians regularly, even Palestinian girls who try to go to a girls' school. There is a monument for Baruch Goldstein, who is the murderer of 29 Palestinians at the Ibrahimi Mosque. They made a monument to a terrorist, and it's, people come and put rocks on it in a sign of respect for Baruch Goldstein. And, I've always wanted to urinate on that monument, but, does that just an illustration of how extreme this is?
Yeah. This is what you said. So both of them used to live in the Kiryat Arba settlement, but that was before they went back to the U.S. and allegedly committed the murder of Alex Odeh and another. Now, since they've come back, they actually live in different settlements. They currently live in two different settlements, not that far south, but still southern West Bank in the Bethlehem area, let's just say. But not only are they, you'd suspect that people, maybe if they are worried about any attention being drawn to them, they would live in some small place and take some small job and not. Yeah, and in fact, one of these men doesn't make a lot of waves, and you wouldn't really know about him, but you'd be surprised. He ended up founding a group that is actually authoring legislation that's passing in the Israeli Knesset. If you can imagine this. All right, so I'm not hiding anywhere, but authoring legislation.
This is Baruch Ben Yosef.
Sorry, no, this is Israel Fuchs or Keith Fuchs.
Okay, so so Keith Fuchs, who goes by Israel Fuchs. Let's just go back. You have Keith Fuchs and Andy Green, right? Keith Fuchs and Andy Green were originally from the U.S. and were part of the JDL under Meir Kahane, right?
You're right. We should have done this basic background stuff. So it's actually three guys, according to the FBI, three guys, the ones you just mentioned, Andy Green, Keith Fuchs, and a third Kahanist, Robert Manning. The three of them are American-born Jewish citizens of the U.S. who all three immigrated to Israel and specifically to the settlement of Kiryat Arba, which you just mentioned, and following their leader, their mentor, Rabbi Kahane, to the most racist settlements in the settlement complex and the West Bank. And then from there, if you can imagine this, so now we talked about those three. I don't want to go into too much detail, but just to break it down for folks who are trying to make heads or tails of it and aren't necessarily going to read the article in the Intercept or whatnot. But of those three, one of them actually was eventually extradited, not for that murder, but for a different murder. So one of the three, Robert Manning, is currently sitting in jail in the U.S. in Arizona, specifically serving a life sentence for another murder that he had committed before the episode of Alex Odeh. Now, the two other men are currently, as I said, living in settlements in the southern West Bank. One of them is Keith Fuchs, who, as I said, he went on to found a group called Meshilut. And this group, Meshilut, is active in authoring legislation that is being passed. Critics would call the group an anti-democratic group, that it's working to weaken the Israeli judiciary. As we talked about in our previous show about Netanyahu weakening the judiciary. So this is one of those groups, these Gongo groups that is working to weaken the judiciary, founded by Fuchs. Another fact that I can tell you about Fuchs is that the street that he lives on, where he bought a house and built and has lived for decades now and raised his family there, is on the only street in the entire country that is named after Jifna, the village where Alex Odeh was born and raised. So,
and the street was named as his house was built there.
So that's right. The street.
I mean, it's a clue. It's not just a coincidence.
Yeah, okay. So let me just say this. All the streets were named at the same time. They were named after a theme. All the streets have a certain theme to them. And it was named that street not because of Alex Odeh. It's a village that's 2,000 years old. Today there's mainly Christian Palestinians who live there in that village. 2,000 years ago, it was a Jewish village. So the name of that village is encoded as a street name in the settlement where Fuchs lives. But yeah, it's the only street so named in the entire country, called, named after Jifna, the village Jifna. It's just a bit too much of a coincidence. It feels like they didn't change the name after the fact, but it feels like did he choose to live there on purpose? Well, every day he walks outside and he sees the name of the street, and it's named after Jifna's favorite son, to which there is a monument in the village of Jifna. There's a monument to Alex Odeh, who was born and raised there and cut in the prime of his life. So I can't help but wonder, was it a coincidence, or is he gloating? Essentially, is this like a trophy
One
every
of
time he walks out the door?
the biggest clues for me was that, what you pointed out, and I didn't know this before, was that Fuchs and Green were in the West Bank in 1983, I believe, and I can't remember which one it was. I think it was Andy Green, who carried out an armed attack on a Palestinian motorist.
Fuchs.
It was Fuchs. Okay, Fuchs.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it was reported in Israeli media that that the Palestinian had splashed a puddle of water on him, so he just opened fire with an M16 rifle on him.
Oh my God.
And this really troubled the Israeli government at the time. The defense minister, Moshe Arens, actually sentenced him to a long prison term. And in the end, the term was negotiated down on the condition that Fuchs serve the rest of his term outside of Israel. So they basically just dumped him into the U.S. They sent a violent sociopath into the United States. I mean, this is like the Zionist version of the Mariella boat lift. And along with Andy Green, who was there, they went to Orange County for a period of 2 years, right?
They weren't in Orange County the whole time. They were
in the U.S.
Yes, they were in the U.S. That's right.
It's like the two 9/11 hijackers who flew directly from the Al-Qaeda summit in Malaysia to Los Angeles and were just picked up by Saudi intelligence in LA. Instead, these guys are picked up by fellow Kahanists in the US. And during that short period when they were in the US on their Kahanist sabbatical, a person is murdered who was putting out ads or overseeing an ad or PR campaign calling on the US to cut its military aid to Israel in newspapers, and was being threatened. So it just seems, pretty unusual that they just kind of came into the US. This Alex Odeh was murdered and then they just left.
Yeah, I mean, it's a crazy story, and I'm glad that you kind of did that. If the Jew was on the other foot, what if, it would cries to the heavens. What if a Palestinian, with long terror records, flew to the U.S. Are suspected of assassinating a Jewish leader, and then come back to the West Bank and then live and they're tight with Abbas. There's so many aspects of this story we can unpack. There's the story of the impunity, the fact that, there's impunity of the suspects themselves. You see how they've lived since then. Let's take that just for an example. So we talked about Andy Green, or in Hebrew, as he's known, Baruch Ben Yosef. So he basically, if you look through Israeli case law, it's replete with references to him. For example, he's part of this crazy case where one of the most famous cases in Israeli case law, where his protege, another Kahanist, a journalist called him a Nazi. You and Kahana, you Nazis. And so they sued this journalist. How dare you call us a Nazi? And you've libeled me. And then the judge is like, oh, well, okay, you know what? You're right. He did libel you. So he convicted, he found the journalist guilty of libel, but because, as he said, the Kahanism, Kahanist ideology, and Nazism were so similar. Therefore, he only fined the journalist 1 shekel. So it's like a quarter.
Wow.
So it's a crazy story. It's a funny story, but it's also like a story that people know. People know that story, but they don't know that it's Baruch Ben Yosef who was the lawyer who argued that.
Baruch Ben Yosef has been a prominent figure in Israeli courts for decades, and this is someone who the FBI told you they pretty much know he's the killer of an American citizen in a terrorist attack. And he argued a case in the Israeli Supreme Court.
More than that, he's been in the Israeli Supreme Court dozens of times. He's sued Israeli ministers. He sues Israeli ministers because they're not right-wing enough for him. He demands more. And
the case that he argued, the most prominent case that he argued in the Israeli Supreme Court is remarkable, right? It was on behalf of Jonathan Pollard, who is the ultimate traitor, who basically handed over names and classified information and business intelligence to the Israeli Mossad out of Zionist ideological dedication. He was a naval intelligence officer, and he is a key figure that Israel is trying to free. And so Ben Yosef, who is apparently the killer of Alex Odeh, shows up in Israeli Supreme Court with Esther Pollard, the wife of Jonathan Pollard, to argue this case. I mean, this guy isn't hiding.
Suing Netanyahu.
Suing Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, this is amazing.
Supreme Court. And this is just months after Netanyahu is in Washington, D.C., speaking to the National Press Club, and he's asked about Alex Odeh on video, on C-SPAN.
Okay,
I don't know if you want to play that little clip.
Let's actually show that clip. This is Sam Husseini, who's a friend of the show. I mean, person that we all know when he was, I think, at the organization that ADC, and he shows up at a press conference in which Netanyahu's there to talk about the so-called peace process, and he asks him about Alex Odeh, and it's a remarkable exchange that ends with a real Freudian slip. So let's show that.
Keith Fuchs and Andy Green are apparently still in Kiryat Arba. And what we've been told, since we're the organization involved in this, is that the Justice Department has not received full cooperation at all from the Israeli government on this matter.
I assure you that our policy is to cooperate fully with the murder.
Okay, so David, what happened? What happened there?
Okay, so I mean, it's really obvious. The cat's out of the bag. You can't watch that video and not, if you understand the context, you understand that Netanyahu knows exactly who these people are, yet he's claiming he's trying to say, well, I don't know about these guys. Who could know where they are? I have no idea what. Please, this is 1998. Okay, 4 years earlier, that Baruch Ben Yosef, who you don't know where he is, where is he, where could he be? I don't know. He was in Israeli jails because he actually holds the record. As far as I know, he holds the record in Israel for the suspected terrorist who has spent the longest amount of time under administrative detention for a Jew. Just really briefly, administrative detention is it's like jailing someone without habeas corpus. It's an undemocratic procedure, but it's like a leftover from British colonialism, and so it's still on the books here. And of course, it's only ever used practically against Palestinians regularly. In very extreme, rare instances, they use it against Jews. So this guy, Baruch Ben Yosef, he has the record in Israel for the Jew, so the suspected terrorists, the Jewish suspected terrorist who has sat the longest in administrative detention. So the number one Jewish suspected terrorist in the country's history. So he's already sat in Israeli jails for 6 months at a time, 6 month stretches of administrative detention, twice. One time in 1980, when apparently him and Kahane himself, they plotted to blow up the Dome of the Rock. Okay? The Muslim shrine in the center of the old city of Jerusalem, the gold dome that like everyone knows and loves, maybe the most beautiful architecture in the country. So that's, according to Israel's top, the chief of Israel's spy agency, internal security services, Shin Bet, that's what he says that Ben Yosef and Kahane did, that they plotted to blow up the Dome of the Rock to hopefully start a, third world war and a clash of civilizations. So in 1980, 6 months for plotting to blow up the Dome of the Rock. In 1994, another time he's arrested and another 6 month sentence. So he now has the record Okay, now 3 years later, Netanyahu doesn't know who he is. 10 months later, the guy's suing you in court, Netanyahu. You still don't know who this guy is. The fact that he mentions Robert Manning, and he's like, oh, but I thought we sent you Robert Manning. So he obviously knows the facts of the case, and he's trying to talk about, oh, I haven't received an extradition, but it didn't come to extradition yet. They're asking you for info. We've even got WikiLeaks years later of Alberto Gonzalez, Bush's attorney general, coming here and in a meeting with Israel's justice minister, then Chaim Ramon, asking him, we want information about Alex. So it's not that they ever dropped it, but they need information in order to put together an indictment. There's no indictment. There can't be an extradition request. So Netanyahu's like, oh, I don't know about no extradition. And in the end, because he knows he's doing dirt, so he comes out. He says, yeah, well, of course we only cooperate with terrorists, So he's throwing, shade on himself. This video really is the proof in terms of all the other crimes Netanyahu is guilty of, the crimes against Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank, here in the country and beyond, and in terms of all the corruption crimes. There's this third level of crime, which is that he's knowingly created a way for these suspected terrorists to live out for decades, to live their lives and to not have to be burdened by the worry that perhaps their past will catch up to them. That thanks to Netanyahu, they can, be safe and secure knowing that the U.S. Justice Department will never catch up to them.
And so you mentioned a subsequent exchange between the U.S. government and the Israeli government, where Alberto Gonzalez, the Department of Justice, head of the Department of Justice under George W. Bush, he traveled to Israel. And during that meeting, he met with Chaim Ramon, who is his counterpart, the justice minister, and he brought up the case of Alex Odeh. And we only learned about this through a State Department cable released on WikiLeaks, the website founded by jailed publisher Julian Assange, who's in jail while the murderers of Alex Odeh are running around arguing cases before the Supreme Court. And what happened there? It looks you actually interviewed Chaim Ramon about this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like a lot of people that I interviewed a lot because, as I mentioned, Ben Yosef, he sued many of these government ministers, demanding the right to sacrifice animals, to slaughter animals on Haram al-Sharif, on the Holy Esplanade in the old city of Jerusalem. So I interviewed all these these ministers or ex-ministers, former ministers. So what's up? Do you remember this? What was the circumstances? What did you think? What did you know? What didn't you know? So, I mean, a lot of these guys, some of them don't. Ramon specifically says he doesn't remember anything. Doesn't remember anything at all. I can't force any, blood out of a stone. If he says he doesn't, he doesn't. Others remember, like when they were sued, and then they do remember. But there was one ex-minister that I spoke to, specifically the ex-police minister, who essentially admitted, yes, it's true. I know that these guys are, suspected of this murder and that they're living here consequence-free. But I'm like, how did, I'm like, why didn't, I'll just say who it is, doesn't matter. The interview's out there. Israel's Rabin's police minister, Moshe Shachal. Moshe Shachal was the police minister under the Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. At that time, when Ben Yosef was arrested for the second time under administrative detention. So now the Israeli, right is all up in arms. At this point, the Israeli, as we just described earlier, the two wings of the Israeli nationalist camp, the far right and the middle right. So, it's the labor Zionists that are in charge, and the Likud, Netanyahu's party, they're in the opposition. So they're demanding, they're standing up for the rights of of Jewish prisoners, while they may be Kahanists. Israel, after the slaughter that you just mentioned, Max, earlier in the show, the massacre at the Ibrahimi Mosque, the Tomb of the Patriarchs, the holy shrine in Hebron, in the southern West Bank, where a follower of Kahana came in and machine gunned and murdered 29 men and boys, Palestinian men and boys. So after this, the government's like very belatedly is like, okay, this really is a terrorist group. I mean, Jews, it doesn't matter now. At this point, like we must treat them as like Hamas or like Islamic Jihad. Quotes from the heads of the Shin Bet. This is how they saw it. So they declare the Kahanist party, the Kah party, to be illegal. They make it illegal, and they're thereby, allow themselves to, give themselves the powers to arrest all the top leadership of the Kahana movement, and that included Ben Yosef, who was in the leadership of the Kahana movement and still is. And so, at this point, it's in the Knesset. I found this in the debates of the Knesset. The right wing, Netanyahu's party, is like, well, why are you, arresting these people? You're putting Jews under administrative detention. Okay, fine, Palestinians, whatever. But Jews, how dare you take prisoners' rights? Don't prisoners have rights too? Don't Jews have rights too? This is the rights. So in disingenuous, they only argue human rights when like the suspected murderers of Palestinian people or anyways. So fighting for those Jewish prisoners, and so Moshe Shachal, then the police minister for Rabin, says, hold on, excuse me, Likud party, you're getting all up in arms because now we are taking Jews and we are arresting them. You're looking at me like I'm doing something unprecedented, something that's, anti-democratic that you couldn't be capable of. Please. It was a Likud government that first instituted this policy, that first used administrative detention against Jews. You're getting mad at me because I'm arresting Ben Yosef and the other Kahanist leaders now. Your party, it was Menachem Begin, the prime minister of the Likud party in 1980, who arrested Ben Yosef the first time and put him under administrative detention the first time with Kahana, right? He says this. Now, when he says this, he uses both his names, Andy Green and Ben Yosef. And then that was really the key in a way.
That's significant because he was living under a dual identity.
Exactly. And so for the longest time, part of the difficulty in getting, finding these guys was that they go under different identities. And so now I had proof of it, even from the transcripts of the Israeli Knesset itself, that acknowledging that these were the same person and that this is the number one suspected Jewish terrorist in Israeli history. So you can't pretend, you don't know who he is. All right, please. So in any case, I interviewed that police minister who mentioned this. He was like, excuse me, but y'all did it first. So that ex-police minister, I interviewed him in his office in Tel Aviv last summer, and he's just, I've heard that. I heard it not then. I heard it after the fact. I heard about this, and what are you going to do? It's like shameful, but that's how it's going to be because there's no political reason for anyone to bring this up after all these years. So it cries to the heavens. Look, I've put out 4 articles at this point, exposing the absurdity of it all, right? And yet there haven't been any follow-up articles. So you'd think that someone here in the country would, think it'd be interesting enough or worthy of comment, but no, imagine that despite the fact that, just a couple months ago, Netanyahu was offering an ambassadorship to the successor, to the protege of one of these alleged assassins of Alex Odeh. You would think that is significant enough, to warrant, but it hasn't. It hasn't been reported on in Hebrew. What can I say? Unfortunately, I'm kind of familiar with this. I've worked on multiple cases like this over the years where, I kind of come upon outrageous scandals that on top of all the other scandals you hear about coming out of Israel, like one you haven't, and then, I have to expose it. And in this case, thankfully, we got our articles out in The Intercept, which is a big journal, and so people heard about it. In other cases, when I'm, for example, reporting, just as an aside, on the first African American to die in the Israeli army. The army first said it was a suicide, that she suicided herself, and my investigation showed that, in fact, she had been murdered by or killed by another soldier. You would think that would be worthy of reporting on, but it wasn't. And so
What was her name?
her name was Tovit Radcliffe.
Tovit Radcliffe. That's right. And so if someone were to Google her name, they would find your investigations.
Exactly. So I mean, the stuff is in the public domain. So I published this stuff out there. Unfortunately, there's so many, there's so many sad stories that are coming out here and around the world. I don't need to tell you.
But I mean, there's kind of a common thread here. There's a common thread. I mean, you were living, first of all, in Dimona at the time, and that's where the Black Hebrew Israelites, the Black Hebrews, have decided to settle. They're not really given citizenship rights in Israel. They're basically kind of there, but they're not there officially. And at the same time, they do serve in the Israeli military. And Tovit Radcliffe was killed in basic training, and it looks like there was a cover-up where
it was later than basic training. She'd already been serving for a while. It wasn't basic training, but whatever. She's on a base in the interior of the country. Yeah. Like
they cover it up
in front of a computer.
And both the Israeli government and the U.S. government just turn their backs on this person who is a Black American. And then you have the U.S. government and the Israeli government also turning their backs on a Arab American, on a Palestinian American. So the common thread is just systematic discrimination, just treating the victims of Israel who are American citizens who happen to be non-white as just non-existent.
I mean, there's so many sad stories that come out of here, so it's frustrating. But one of the things that came out of this investigation for me was the fact that not that was so systemic in a way. Like it pointed to the fact that there was some real systemic problems here. These aren't just bad a few bad apples or something like that. I'll give an example. So why is it that this was able to happen, that these suspects were able to live here basically consequence-free for the last 35 years? So the thing is, digging, I found out that in 1978, the Israeli Knesset legislated a new extradition law. And under these new law, why did it feel the need to legislate a new extradition law? And so again, in the Knesset debate itself, you read what they say, and what they say is we're worried about a recurrence of another similar situation like Jerome Zeller, and we don't want Zeller being sent back to the U.S. because that would be like a slave sent back to the slave master. Now, of course, you need to kind of know the backstory to understand this isn't just a dude. This is another Kahanist alleged assassin. This is another Kahanist killer, according to the FBI. Jerome Zeller is the murderer of Iris Konis, the man who planted a bomb at the offices of Saul Yurok in 1972. This is, again, kind of complex. Again, we're going back even further than 85. We're going back to 1972. But this is at the time when Kahana's Jewish Defense League, that was his vehicle in the U.S., and too much to talk about. And I really recommend people to get a chance to watch my last lecture that I gave called Messiah Mode. If you go online, check out that lecture. It's on YouTube. Messiah Mode. It's a lecture I gave at the university. Well, I gave it many places, but the recording is from the University of Zurich in Switzerland. And so I kind of go through Kahana's whole history. But in 1972, at that point, what Kahana is doing is he's based in the U.S. and he's trying to organize American Jews to protest the Soviet Union, and in fact to BDS the Soviet Union, to demand that everyone comply with a boycott of all things Soviet. In this case, Soviet cultural productions. In this case, even though of course there was barely any cultural exchange between the U.S. and the USSR, this is like the height of the Cold War, right? But there's small, detente, or like efforts to bridge the gap between these cultures. Whatever, I'm not going to get into all the, the nitty-gritty of the politics, but the point is that there were people like Saul Yurok, who was an impresario, an organizer of concerts, and he brought in the Bolshoi Ballet and different Soviet cultural productions because he broke the boycott. He didn't comply with the Kahanists' BDS of all things Soviet, and because he brought this Soviet ballet troupe to the United States. So therefore, the Kahanists said, well, we will force you to comply, and we will force you with physical violence. And they bombed his office. And Saul Hiroko was injured. He survived, but one of his secretaries, that happened to be a Jewish woman, she was killed. And so the men fled. The people responsible for that fled. Some of them were tried in the U.S. Dershowitz got them off. But one of them, the one who actually apparently placed the bomb there, he fled to Israel. And he's lived in Israel ever since. And so here after all this is in 1972. So now in 1978, just a few years later, they're changing the law, and they're saying in the Knesset, they're saying, we need to change this law. We need to make sure that the law takes into account different scenarios, including the fact that someone like Jerome Zella, like this Kahanist killer, can come here, and we got to make sure that he won't be sent back to the U.S. God forbid. So my point is, it wasn't like it was a random stance, happenstance. It wasn't like an accident that these guys could get back here and live out their days. This was planned. This was organized. This was legislated. I mean, that's just one example of it. I later went on and I interviewed the former head of the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security services or internal spy agency, and so this is the one who was the head of the spy agency at the time of Rabin. Rabin was in power, including during his assassination. But a decade earlier, he was the head of the Jewish department. In fact, he was the first head of the Jewish department, the first head of the division of a spy agency that was devoted to non-Arab or non-Palestinian terror. In this case, for the most part, Jewish terror. So, and there was no small amount of it at the time in the mid-'80s. So in any case,
I mean, the irony of it all is like the first government to lock them up was headed by a former Jewish terrorist whose successor was a former Jewish terrorist, Begin and Shamir. These were Irgun and Stern Gang guys. So it's just generations of terrorists obtaining public office and positions of high esteem.
Oh, gosh. I mean, I asked, I mean, the ironies abound. The ironies abound. But I remember interviewing Carmen Guillon, and what he said to me was that, look, that was policy. I mean, he's like, I can't speak to policy now. I can speak to policy in the Shin Bet up until the time that I left the organization as the head of the organization in 1995, and that was well over a decade after the assassination of Alex Odeh. And he's like, in all that time, we didn't give information to the U.S. We didn't give information to any, non-Israeli intelligence group. If someone asked, I mean, of course, if they were non-Jewish, yes, but if they were Jewish, and if a foreign security agency or justice, law enforcement organization asked us for information about a Jewish suspect, we did not give it. That was policy. We see this even now in cases that don't involve nationalism, nationalism is a euphemistic way of saying, racist terror. But even in cases that don't involve racist terror and don't, like we've been talking about the assassination of Alex Odeh. So even in cases of criminals who do not...
Just a pop quiz. Can you name the only Jew who was rejected for asylum by Israel?
Yeah. You must be talking about Meyer Lansky?
Yep. Meyer Lansky. There was do you know who Samuel Scheinbein is?
Yeah, that's another character.
So we're playing Israel Extradition Jeopardy. Who is Samuel Scheinbein?
Oh man, that's really gruesome.
Or he was who?
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, this is an American who committed murder, a gruesome murder in the U.S. and then fled to Israel. Am I correct in recalling that it also occurred around the turn of the millennium?
Yep. Impressive. He actually killed a friend of his, Freddie Tello Jr., in Aspen Hill, which is not far from here, not far from where I grew up. It's like on the Maryland side of where I grew up. And he fled to Israel, and Israel was actually holding him there and was happy to have him there. He had murdered his friend, chopped him into pieces, and hid him in the trunk of his car. And then when they found his friend chopped up, because they had a fight, He just flew to Israel, and then Israel engaged in what the Washington Post called a sensational legal tug of war with Washington. And I think he was given up as part of like the peace process negotiations.
This is what I was trying to get at. I mean, you made a good point there, that even in the case of a guy who, it wasn't that he was committed a crime or suspected of committing a crime, out of love for Israel or something like that, or out of a mistaken, passion for, a murderous passion for Zionism. No, this is a guy who just killed someone and then just fled to Israel, and Israel still, made it very difficult for him to be sent back. And that's what we see with lots of cases like the Malka Leifer case that I alluded to earlier in the first half of our discussion, which is that, people, I'm really sad to report this, but even people who commit crimes that have nothing to do, like even Malka Leifer, the situation with that Australian school principal who is alleged to have raped dozens of Jewish schoolgirls, and she fled to Israel and has been living in Israel for years now under the protection of Israel's health minister, because she happens to be a member of the same sect. And the health minister is now being, coming up on corruption charges because of this, but Netanyahu is still keeping him as health minister. We see the point is that, yes, there is impunity, and yes, there, sadly, sickeningly, you don't even have to hate Palestinians to be somehow deserving of this, state defense of killers who flee here, because even people who commit crimes that that aren't nationalistically motivated are still receiving aid or still receiving harbor because only they are born in as you would say, Max, have J positive blood.
Right.
It's a very, very sad story.
Yeah, it's like if so many kind of common criminals would flee from France or Australia to ISIS and Al Qaeda held territory in Syria. But in this case, if you are a Jewish criminal, you just flee to JSIL, the Jewish state in Israel and the Levant, and they pretty much are going to take care of you. But here you have two very prominent individuals in Fuchs and Ben Yosef, Andy Green, and they are actually part of a movement in Israel that is incipient within the settler movement. It's called the Temple Movement, right? And this is sort of derivative of all of those attempts that you were describing to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Describe this movement, because I think this hints at why the Israeli government is being so protective of these individuals, because not only are they, incipient within Israeli government and the Likud party, even there's also a fear of what they can do. They kind of have the government by the balls.
Yeah. Well, certainly up until just recently, if in fact this Netanyahu-Gantz government makes it past the finish line, is sworn in, then he's bought himself a little bit of time, as we just said. But up until the last election, Netanyahu has spent a year courting the Kahanist party, and bending over backwards, and I'm talking about giving him, making him the head of the committee that decides who will be the judges. Who will be the judges in the state of Israel will be decided by Ben Yosef's protege. Like this is how crazy we get. So,
what is the Temple movement?
Besides wanting to ethnically cleanse the country of non-Jews, the Kahanists also want to turn that ethnically cleansed Jewish state from a ethnocracy that is nominally secular to a theocracy, to a full-on halakha state, or I guess the equivalent of a Sharia state, a monarchy, a religious monarchy in their mind. Now, this never existed, because even at the time when there were, Jewish monarchs thousands of years ago, there was no state, the apparatus of the state that we have today. But in their minds, they're, hankering for some fantastical, fantasy that didn't exist ever in those conditions. But if, it would be put into practice, we are talking about ISIS in the worst way. We're talking about not only ethnically cleansing the country of non-Jews, but destroying the mosques that are on the Holy Esplanade, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, building a Jewish temple there. In that temple, Judaism will revert to a pre-rabbinic period when Jews did not pray, but instead they sacrificed animals on the regular. And in fact, on Jewish holidays, they would all come to Jerusalem and sacrifice over 10,000 animals in a day. Imagine the bloodshed, 10,000 animals in a day being slaughtered on that place. So, okay, we have a meat industry that's slaughtering animals, 10,000 animals in a minute, around the world, I'm sure. So we can't be too judgmental about that, but they want to wipe out the Muslim shrines that are there. This is like the third holiest Muslim shrine in the world. They want to do it partly to stick their fingers in the eye of the Palestinian people, because it's not only for Muslims that this is important. It's become, a symbol of Palestinian nationalism for all Palestinians, because it's like the only open air place in Jerusalem, in Palestinian areas of Jerusalem, that the Palestinians have some semblance of control over after 70 years of occupation. So this is a Palestinian symbol. The Templars, the Jewish Templar movement, wants to demolish the mosques and build their temple on it, partly to stick their finger in the eye of all Palestinian people, but partly because it's the first step or one step along the way of making manifest the theocracy, the religious monarchy that they want to come into existence. There will be a dictatorship. It will be interpreted, all the laws will be the laws of the Torah and the Talmud, and the most, the strictest interpretations of them. And what this means, according to the leaders of the Temple movement, according to the chief rabbi of the Temple movement, in the presence of Ben Yosef, Dan Cohen, our friend and colleague, was with me, and the two of us recorded the chief rabbi of the Templar movement, Israel Ariel, and who happened to be Kahana's number 2 when Kahana was running for Knesset. So we have recorded him saying that not only should the Jewish army ethnically cleanse Israel and the territories, but it should also go beyond the borders of Israel, not just Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt, but even Iraq, Iran, Turkey, just should go out into the world, and wherever they see mosques and wherever they see churches, they must demand that the locals tear them down. And if they refuse to tear them down, then genocide them by sword.
It's a genocidal, theocratic, and imperialist movement within the settlement movement that is really, I think, it's Jewish dominionism, and it's becoming increasingly popular among religious nationalist settlers, even in the interior of Israel.
Yes, this used to be considered super fringe, right? Because even historically, most Israelis were secular, right? The state was a secular state, even though it was a Jewish state. It was ethnically, the privilege that you had as a Jew was based on your ethnicity, not based on how religious you were or not irreligious you were. But now, since 1967, since the capture of the West Bank and what's considered, the historic heartline of the Bible narrative, and so the religious, if many religious Jews once said, "Oh, the Messianic era will come, and it'll be God who brings it down into," so even though I have kind of like a weird racist vision of what end times should look like, and Jews dominate everything and non-Jews are slaves or dead, or agree to be part of some some subservient quasi slave race or slave religion that gives fealty to us. So that's really weird and sick. But we say, oh, it won't come in our through our own actions. It'll be because God comes down from the heavens himself. Well, you're basically saying it's not going to happen. You've basically been inherited. You've inherited this really raw racist interpretation of a spiritual path. That's what the Orthodox Jewry ended up with in the Talmud. One that views non-Jewish people as a form of non-humans that need to be ethnically cleansed from the country, from Israel. And so receiving this, really horrific, racist tinged religion, they postponed it to a messianic era. They said, well, that ideal Jew-only future you're describing as should to be the religious optimal, that will only happen when God comes down. We don't have to have an active agency in it. Until then, we will live, with our non-Jewish neighbors in relative peace. But now, since we're living post-67, Israel managed to capture all these territories, more than it had ever had before, quadruple this territory. And since then, Israel's only succeeded more and more on the political stage. It's managed to, really its aggressiveness hasn't received any pushback from any other force.
Right. I mean, the Trump deal of the century is kind of the ultimate boon to the Temple movement. And it's sort of a confirmation of their prophecies in many ways. And there were representatives of their movement in the room when Trump and Netanyahu announced it, at least sympathizers of it.
Look, Trump's ambassador to Israel himself, David Friedman, is, himself a contributor to the Kahanist group that funneled into the one that's writing legislation. Okay, he's funded that Kahanist group, the one that we talked about earlier, Meshilut, the one that funded into Meshilut. Then we also have
U.S.-Israeli reciprocal ambassador David Friedman.
U.S.-Israeli reciprocal ambassador David Friedman.
Yeah, that's what we have to call him. He donated money to a Kahanist group.
Yes, that's correct. He donated money to a Kahanist group. That Kahanist group is called Komemiyut. Yeah. And that group that received funding from reciprocal ambassador David Friedman, leaders of that group, combined with Israel Fuchs, Keith Fuchs, they founded Meshilut, that's actually authoring legislation in the Israeli Knesset. But back to the reciprocal ambassador David Friedman, my point is that, we just saw recently him being photographed, being presented, with a photograph of Israel's, essentially the holy shrines, the Muslim shrines in Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa, being wiped out, photoshopped away, and in their place, the so-called Jewish temple being photoshopped on it, and it was blown up to a massive photograph, and it was being presented to Friedman as a present, and he has this like massive smile, like a shit-eating grin, he couldn't be happier, he's eating himself up. So, we have a quasi-Kahanist or a pastel Kahanist literally in charge of U.S.-Israel relations. So the American government, the American foreign policy towards Israel is essentially, it's the Kahanists, right? So they are even more right-wing than the Israeli government for maybe the first time ever. I mean, right? So imagine the situation now.
Yeah, this is actually a good segue. I mean, if you read Rashid Khalidi's book, Brokers of Deceit, he talks about how for many decades, the U.S. government has been much more maximalist and extreme in its demands than even the Israeli government in the so-called imaginary peace process. And David, while we're going to wrap up this second part here, this actually reminds me of a question that I've just been kind of percolating on in this discussion here, and that is how Kahanism is made in the USA. I mean, this fascism, this is a fascist movement, and like many other fascist movements, I mean, it had its origins not actually in Israel, it had its origins in Brooklyn. I used to live in Flatbush, very close to Brooklyn College, and if you look at Meir Kahane's life, I mean, this is a guy, he was born in Brooklyn in 1932, so this is nearly 2 decades before Israel was even created, and he didn't immigrate into Israel until 1971. So he was nearly 40 years old. He was 39, and that was after he founded the Jewish Defense League, which is the fascist terrorist group that he founded in New York City. He went to school at Brooklyn College. He got his entire start as an extremist organizing in the United States. And then as we're talking about, many of these extremists, they were radicalized in the US and then subsequently immigrated to Israel. So I think there's this interesting mapping where just as at the formal electoral political level, the representatives of the US government also are the most extreme ideologically when it comes to Israel, pushing the most maximalist positions and dispossession against Palestinians. And similarly, the radical far-right forces in Israel are the ones who were born and raised and studied in the United States until they were 30, 40, 50 years old, and then they subsequently immigrate to Israel and become the kind of the forefront of this extremely racist fascist movement to colonize all of historic Palestine and exponential, ethnically cleanse all of the remaining Palestinians.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's true. I have noticed that as well. It's frightening, and it speaks for itself. I think if I could just maybe add just a couple words of context, just to roll back. Yeah, this is Ghana. This is what he did to the American Jewish context. Think about the time period in which he came up. Yeah, he grew up in Brooklyn, came up right at the Holocaust. And because of the failure of the American Jewish community I should rather say, of the American Jewish leaders to actually do something significant to stop the Holocaust. In other words, instead of actually boycotting the German government at that time and forcing it to fall right before it actually turned into the most genocidal political movement in the last century. So,
or allowing to let in Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazi Holocaust, because they were banned from entering the U.S. for the most part. There was very few.
Mm-hmm. So because of this, it's so true what you said. So few were allowed in, and unfortunately, the Jewish communal leaders failed the Jewish community, and they didn't mount strong enough struggle to help their brethren in the U.S. in Europe, rather, in the European theater under Nazi-controlled Europe. And so this is kind of rummaging around in Kahana's head, feeling like we didn't do enough. So then, when he comes on the scene in 1968, right after the Six-Day War, again, that messianic, movement coming up, and Kahana saying, well, you Jewish leaders didn't do anything last time to protect Jews. So I'm not going to listen to you when you say if it's right or not right that I stand up for Jews. And so that was part of the way that he was able to motivate many Jews to, even though he had a very fascist vision and he spoke of Jewish supremacy and Jewish exclusivity and Jewish separateness, and we think of these things as I said, proto-fascist and outright fascist. But part of the reason he was able to sweep up so many in the Jewish community is because the Jewish community's leadership, such as it was, had failed in the previous rounds.
Well, I think there's one other factor. I mean, that's absolutely right. And you're the expert on it. I mean, I'm not trying to say I know more about it than you, but I think there's one other factor though that also has to be just taken into context. And you kind of briefly mentioned it. I think we can't understand the rise of Kahanism, and especially how the U.S. government kind of fostered it, or at least allowed it to grow and fester in New York City, with a lot of local politicians in Flatbush and Brooklyn and even other parts of New York kind of supporting, funding, or at least kind of flirting with Kahanism. And that's because it was kind of the far-right vanguard against the Soviet Union that was allowed to operate because they were organizing around this idea, this notion that the Soviet Union was supposedly so anti-Semitic and Soviet Jews were so oppressed, and it's like apartheid South Africa, which of course they supported, and they were organizing all of these campaigns to try to force Jewish immigration out of the Soviet Union into Israel, and getting a lot of support from the US government. And of course, Meir Kahane and the Kahanists, that was the kind of issue in the US, at least in the context, which I don't know as much about the history in Israel, but I remember, the first time I ever heard about the Kahanists was in the context of fighting to force the immigration of Soviet Jews out of Israel, out of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, there were two factors in the rise of Kahanism in the U.S., and that was one. As David illustrated, it was particularly pronounced in the early 70s when the campaign to liberate Soviet Jewry began as sort of an official Jewish communal campaign. And I think it was Mort Halperin, or one of the major leaders of Jewish communal organizations, who said that they had a kind of wink and a nod agreement with the Kahanists that they would go out and terrorize Soviet diplomats. And you even had someone named Vincent Van Seer who was convicted and jailed for, I think, 5 or 7 years for throwing firebombs at Soviet diplomats. And his right-hand man was Dov Hykind, who is currently an assembly member in New York, I think in Flatbush.
He just retired.
He just retired,
recently.
but this is someone who, is just a perpetual gadfly in New York politics. Who was always he was technically a Democrat, so he could always endorse the right-wing Republican and say, "I am a Democrat, but the Republican is better on Israel." This is someone who was an unapologetic member of a terrorist organization, but they were basically the armed wing of Jewish communal groups that were considered mainstream and wore suits. Then the other factor was the desire of U.S. security services, the FBI, to interrupt and weaken Black organizing, Black political organizing, radical Black political organizing. And so Kahana was actually an FBI asset. I wrote about this in The Management of Savagery, and he was basically tasked with creating tension between Jews and Blacks in New York. And a lot of Jews who were in neighborhoods where the Black population was rising, many Jews eventually would leave and move to white flight districts or whatever. But at this time of tension, when all these Charles Bronson revenge flicks were coming out, a lot of younger Jews, they wanted to get together and fight the Blacks. And, they had this feeling like, they would discover their manhood and not be these weak kind of diaspora Jews if they got interested in Zionism. And Kahana organized them. And behind the scenes, this is someone who was working with the FBI to fuel these tensions. And the whole point was basically to ultimately impugn Black people as anti-Semitic, and particularly their own communal organizations. This whole legacy lasts till today. The legacy of Kahanism is still really present in the U.S. through this constant, the constant allegations against Ilhan Omar of being an anti-Semite. It all takes place against this background, which I think was deliberately fueled by the domestic security state. So Kahana comes out of that. He was also a huge fraud who was having an affair with a Gentile model. And when he broke up with her and said, "Well, I'm not going to marry you, you're not Jewish," she jumped off a bridge. And this was reported in the New York press. So then he kind of starts propels him into Israel.
If I could respond to a couple of things you said. Yeah, not only did he, have an affair, and get this woman pregnant and then say you're going to marry her. And then on the day of the wedding, on the girl's birthday or on Kahana's birthday or whatever it was, then on the day that you're supposed to marry her, she gets a letter and saying, "Sorry, I'm not going to marry you. I've been cheating on my wife this whole time, but I'm going to stay with her because I'm Jewish and you're not." And then she committed suicide the next day.
By the way, she was only 21 years old when she killed herself, wasn't she?
23, something like that, early 20s. But I mean,
she was way younger than he was.
Yeah, goes without saying. But I mean, really, to me, the key here is that he went on for years, not only in Israel, certainly in Israel, but even before then, and he, preached for only endogamy, preached against miscegenation. The Jews shouldn't mate, shouldn't breed with non-Jews. A eugenics program essentially. And when he came here, I mean, he actually called to make it illegal for Jews and non-Jews to have sex with one another, and to, make it a punishable crime by a prison sentence if you have any form of sexual relations, a Jew with a non-Jew. I mean, this is how sick this, and actually he founded or I shouldn't say founded, but, really the anti-miscegenation patrols that go throughout Israeli cities today that still exist, the Lahava movement, that's really, the brainchild of Kahana himself. And he, if you can imagine, that not only did he, is he the brainchild behind these racist, anti-miscegenation patrols in Israeli cities
funded
today. Yes, often in cooperation with local police forces. And so this, this group, this guy who founded, and who incited this whole, these anti-miscegenation patrols, he himself, had this long-ass affair with, not several non-Jewish women, but at least one that he got pregnant and then committed suicide once he broke it off with her. So, some sick levels of, the internalized stuff that made up Meir Kahane. But I just want to say maybe a couple more words, because you alluded to some things about how the Kahanists actually in the U.S. would work with the more mainstream groups in the right-wing Jewish community, and one of them, it wasn't only around the Soviet Jewry issues, but also it was. But you would see that the ADL and the JDL, on the face of it, the ADL is like, oh, we got nothing to do with them, and like, oh, they're blah 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 blah. They'll put out reports stating all these things that the JDL done, but they did work with them hand in glove. As you pointed out, it was like a good cop, bad cop, or the good Jew, they're the bad Jew. But they would work for the same objectives again and again. So, for example, in the 1970s, we'd have a situation where the ADL would publish a list, a list of the New York City banks that allegedly do not do business in the state of Israel or with the state of Israel. So obviously the ADL is saying, this isn't good, this is wrong, these banks are, BDSing Israel, allegedly. So within a week, the JDL or JDL spin-off group, whatever, the same one that Dov Heikind was the leader of, Soil. So that JDL spin-off group actually attacks 10 of those banks in the week that followed. If you can imagine that. So ADL publishes a list of these banks that don't do business in Israel, and 10 of those banks are attacked, with like Molotov cocktails and their windows shattered in the week that follows. So we see this parallel. Another thing was the attacks on the ADC, Alex Odeh. So yeah, on one hand, we have the JDL. Even before the attacks on the office on the West Coast, we have the offices on the East Coast, in New York coming under attack, in Boston coming under a bomb attack, in DC. So they're being attacked by the JDL, but at the same time, the ADL is spying on the ADC, on Alex Odeh. The ADC has a spy in Alex Odeh's office. They got a key to his office. They got a map of his office. Their spy can go in there whenever he feels like it and do whatever he wants. And that's the level, because the ADL is essentially a sectarian spy agency, maybe call them the deep diaspora. They kind of masquerade as a civil rights group, but they're a right-wing Israeli sectarian spy agency.
And they spied on the anti-apartheid movement, as Ben is going to mention, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say they spied not only on the anti-apartheid movement, they also spied on leftists who were organizing against the arming of fascist dictators in Central America in the Contra Wars, because, of course, when Congress tried to prevent the U.S. from funding Contra Wars in Central America and the murderous genocidal campaign of General Rios Montt in Guatemala, Israel took the place of the U.S. and began supporting this genocidal regime that carried out literal genocide that was convicted by the International Court. And the ADL, of course, strongly supported Israel's position of support for these fascist military juntas in Central America. So they spied on leftist anti-war activists who had nothing to do with Israel and Palestine sometimes, but were organizing against these wars in Central America.
And the ADL currently, and I assume during the 1980s, worked hand in glove also with local law enforcement and federal law enforcement. And today they're one of the major organizations that brings law enforcement at all levels to Israel for sort of training and Hasbara, propaganda, indoctrination.
All this is true. And just to bring it back to Alex Odeh, who we started talking about at the door, not only was ADL spying on him, but the head of the ADL spy master, the head of the whole spy operation, Irvin Swall, okay, he would regularly meet with Mordechai Levy. This is the JDL operative who would constantly attack the ADC. At this time, think about it, the context. The ADL had made this is the 1980s, mid-80s, Arab Americans are just really for the first time coming into themselves as a community and organizing politically as a community. And the ADL with its, regular briefs explaining how all these Arab American groups were just a front for the Arab states, and they had a master plan, and it was all propaganda, everything. So basically, they, up until that point, only the Zionist narrative held sway in Washington. So as soon as the Arab Americans, for the first time, are starting to come out with a voice of their own and speak out against Israel's invasion of Lebanon and et cetera. There shouldn't be military aid to Israel. Let's spend that money here at home. So at that point, the ADL starts, focusing on the ADC, spying on them. But as the JDL spin-off groups are attacking, and crank calling Alex Odeh, yeah, we're going to kill you, or pretending to call from a rape crisis center, we're going to rape you, and just harassing on both coasts, the offices of the ADC, the Jewish terrorist who was executing all these, attacks and threats on the ADC, he's regularly meeting with Erwin Swell. This is like reported in the Washington Post. I found this. They would regularly meet and swap stories and exchange intel. So the head ADL spy master is, having a tete-a-tete regularly with the head JDL, top JDL terrorists. So really, these two groups are like good cop, bad cop, hand in glove. And in this way, they advanced the right-wing Zionist agenda all these years. Then you mentioned all kinds of examples. We could go on forever, but kind of the nasty stuff that the ADL has been responsible for all these years. And what's even more chutzpahdik is they do it in our name, pretending that they're not just speaking for themselves, an undemocratic group that has its own funders or whatnot, and they represent their own ideology, but actually claim that they speak for the Jewish people when they say what is racism, what isn't racism, what's anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish racism, what's Jewish racism, as if these people have a leg to stand on and have any say whatsoever in determining, a definition of what is and isn't racist, and in trying to gaslight people into thinking that, not agreeing to Jewish supremacy in Israel is, unless you agree to, full spectrum supremacy for Jews in Israel, then you yourself are a hater of Jews. So, really some sick stuff. So I thought it was important to kind of mention how one group, although pretending to stay at arm's distance, and they supposedly speak as like the official voice of the community, really, just like Netanyahu and the Kahanists we see, and then on the American side, the ADL and the JDL, unless we expose this stuff, it seems like they're going to continue to, that is going to be a force that animates Israeli politics. It has in the past, and there's no reason why it's going to stop in the future.
Yeah, so I mean, that really is a good transition, as we talked about, a transition to conclude the episode, because as we talked about in part one, what we've seen is really the retrenchment of permanent right-wing rule with the coalition deal that Netanyahu just inked with Benny Gantz. And they're moving towards annexation, which has been an open annexation in a really public way of major settlement blocks. And so this is sort of the fulfillment of another goal of the Kahana movement and the settlement movement. And they're doing it in a coalition with the former chief of staff of the Israeli army, sort of the face of the Israeli establishment. So I always say, I was too soft on Israel in my book, Goliath, which basically laid out it presented readers with the lay of the land of a sort of one state under right-wing apartheid control. And since I published that book, we've seen sort of different levels of consolidation of right-wing control and the fulfillment of Kahanist, of the Kahana wet dream. And I think, you've elucidated that really well, David, throughout this conversation, just the progression of extremism and the mainstreaming of views that were once seen as completely extreme, even within the Likud party. So thanks a lot for joining us. Where can our listeners follow and our viewers follow your work?
Sure. It's really easy. just my website is my name, davidsheen.com. So there's davidsheen.com, and you can follow me at Twitter at David Sheen, Facebook, all that. And latest piece in Electronic Intifada, and that's called Trump's Jerusalem Plan Rewards Suspected Killer of Alex Odeh. And
Yeah,
you can, that's the one that just came out, and the one in The Intercept, you also might want to check out. That's a nice piece called Decades After Palestinian American Activist Was Assassinated, blah, 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 blah. You check it out on The Intercept, Alex Odeh, search that on Google, and it'll be like the first time it comes up because no one's writing about this. Check it out and demand people start making some noise and do something about this.
Yeah. Thank you for doing this work that no one else is doing and very few other people are acknowledging. And, if you want to see more of David's work, watch his lectures on his website. I think, he's exploring issues within Israeli and Zionist politics and theological streams that I think few others are doing, and explaining it in an accessible way, even though it's really bracing. It's really disturbing to watch. Baruch Ben Yosef, Israel Fuchs, it appears that you're guilty of the murder of Alex Odeh, and you should be brought to justice someday. Feel free to sue me. It wouldn't be the first phony lawsuit brought against me by a certifiable psychopathic loser who is a malignant presence in the world. So bring it on. But Dave, so far these very litigious individuals haven't sued David Sheen. If you like the work we're doing, support us at patreon.com/moderate rebels. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thanks, everyone.